Let me read an excerpt from the January 17, 1988 New York Times about the opposition Ronald Reagan faced in negotiating an arms agreement with the Soviet Union. It may sound familiar to what you're hearing today about President Obama's efforts in Iran, and I quote, "Already, right-wing groups have mounted a strong campaign against the INF Treaty. They have mailed out close to 300,000 letters opposing it. They've circulated 5,000 cassette recordings of General Bernard Rogers, former Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, attacking it. And finally, they're preparing to run newspaper ads this month savaging Ronald Reagan as a new Neville Chamberlain, signing an accord with Hitler and gullibly predicting, quote, peace for our time, end of quote." These were conservative Republican critics of President Ronald Reagan, who was negotiating with the Soviet Union to try to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, being likened to Neville Chamberlain. Sound familiar? The conservative National Review magazine, in May of 1987, had a cover with the title, "Reagan's Suicide Pact." President Reagan eventually agreed with then Secretary of State Shultz that arms control could and would improve U.S. national security. In December of 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, committing the two superpowers to eliminate all their nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. This treaty, the Reagan-Gorbachev Soviet Union Arms Control Treaty, was one of the first to rely on extensive on-site negotiations for verification. Do you remember who coined the phrase, "trust but verify"? It was Ronald Reagan in his negotiations with the Soviet Union. It took 5 months after Ronald Reagan reached this agreement for this chamber to vote 93-5 in favor of that treaty, at a time when the Democrats had a majority. I could go through the long list of Democratic senators who supported President Ronald Reagan in his efforts to try to create a more peaceful world. Ultimately, because of that agreement, more than 2,000 short, medium, and intermediate range missiles were destroyed. Our relationship with the Soviet Union didn't improve overnight, and we certainly still have our problems with them today. But going back to what I said earlier, the Russians sat on the same side of the table as the United States in this negotiation for this agreement to end the threat, or at least delay the threat, of nuclear power, nuclear weapons in Iran. Mr. President, imagine if 47 senators, during the course of Ronald Reagan's negotiation with Gorbachev, if 47 senators had written in the middle of those negotiations to Mr. Gorbachev and said, ignore President Ronald Reagan. Don't negotiate with him because we're not going to accept it here in Congress. There would have been cries of treason for sending that kind of letter. It didn't happen. Those were the days when there was a bipartisan approach to foreign policy in the United States. So today, we have a chance and an opportunity with Iran that hasn't presented itself for more than 30 years. The opportunity to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It's not going to solve all the problems with Iran overnight, but it does solve, I believe, one critical one. The agreement retains U.S. freedom of action to counter Iran any part of the world. After all, Ronald Reagan didn't stop trying to counter Soviet actions after negotiating an arms treaty with Gorbachev. President Obama will not and should not stop working to diminish Iran's influence after this agreement. Mr. President, I'm under no illusions that for some period, Iran did pursue a nuclear bomb. If that had happened, it would have been disastrous. And I'm under no illusions that Iran lied in the past about these efforts. I know they did. But the agreement reached last week provides unprecedented safeguards and inspections to prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons now or in the future. The United States and its allies are strong enough to enter into this agreement, not because Iran is suddenly trustworthy or an open democracy, but because it serves our national security interests to do it. Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman negotiated this agreement with a single focus: prevent Iran from getting any closer to obtaining a nuclear weapon. They achieved that goal, and that's why I'm supporting this effort by the President. to bring a more stable and peaceful situation to the Middle East. To appreciate the magnitude of their challenge, let's step back and take stock of Iran's nuclear weapons program as it is today before this agreement goes in place. Iran currently has enough nuclear material to make 10 nuclear weapons. It has more than 19,000 centrifuges, many of which are more advanced and powerful. Immediately prior to the interim agreement with P5+1, Iran was enriching its uranium to 20%. The breakout time, the time it would take for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, was estimated 3 months. It was an incredibly large and dangerous nuclear capability, growing at a significant rate, virtually unconstrained. That's what this president inherited from the previous administration. But thanks to this effort, this agreement cuts off every single one of Iran's potential pathways to a bomb. It shrinks major portions of their nuclear infrastructure. It eliminates many parts of it. It extends the breakout time to at least 1 year. Should Iran renege on this and decide they're going forward with a nuclear weapon, we believe that under this agreement, it will take them at least a year to achieve it, a year in which we can put pressure and more if necessary. The agreement reduces Iran's uranium stockpile by 98%, cuts its number of centrifuges by more than 2/3, and for the next 15 years caps its enrichment at 3.67%. It prevents Iran's underground facility at Fordow from being used for uranium enrichment. Iran is required to change its heavy water reactor at Iraq so that it can no longer produce weapons-grade plutonium. How will we know? Because we are helping to design and to monitor the fuel in and out of this facility and verifying it every step of the way. All of us have deep suspicions about Iran's nuclear ambitions, and we should. What if they try to build a secret facility? Well, our negotiating team designed a verification plan with no exits, led by an extraordinary man, Secretary of Energy Moniz. Our team thought long and hard over the last 2 years about how we might be able to stop cheating. For every potential technique, they embedded a countermeasure in the text of the agreement. This week, Secretary Moniz explained it would be, quote, virtually impossible, close quote, to hide nuclear activities under this agreement. It's the strongest nuclear verification system ever imposed on a peaceful nation. Its end result is that Iran will not be able to do anything of significance without being caught. And, going back to Ronald Reagan, our inspectors will be on the ground.
Senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent for 5 additional minutes.
Without objection.
This agreement requires the IAEA have 24/7 access to all of Iran's declared nuclear facility. This means in-person inspectors, remote cameras, tamper-proof seals, all of the world's most sophisticated detection technology. As one nuclear expert commented last week, if a rat enters a nuclear facility in Iran, we will know it. Critically, this intrusive monitoring goes all the way in to the nuclear supply chain, from uranium mines to centrifuge production. We cover it all in this agreement. I see the senator from South Dakota is here, and I'll wrap up by putting the rest of this in the record. But let me conclude. When I sat down to read this agreement, and I don't know how many of my colleagues have, I was struck on the 3rd page with this statement in the agreement with Iran. Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapon. That's quite a statement. It was our goal at this negotiation. Do I believe it? Some, but I have my doubts. That's why we had to have an inspection regime, from the uranium mines right through the production facilities. That's why we had to dramatically cut back on their capacity to build weapons-grade fuel. And that's why this agreement is now, most of the countries believe, moving us in the right direction in Iran. There are critics. We've heard a lot of them here in the Senate. There isn't a single critic who stepped up with a better idea. They say, well, let's go back to the sanctions regime. The countries that joined us in that sanctions regime did it to bring Iran to the negotiating table, and it worked. They now have an agreement that they believe in, and we should believe in too. To think that we're going to renew sanctions or unilateral sanctions, that to me is something not likely to occur if Iran lives up to the terms of this agreement. And let me add the other alternative. We know the cost of war. We know it in human lives. We know it in the casualties that return. We know it in the cost to the American people. Given a choice between the invasion of Iran or working in a diplomatic fashion toward a negotiation so that we can lessen this threat in the world, I think President Obama made the right choice. I support this administration's decision to go forward with this agreement. I'll be adding my vote to many in the Senate in the hopes that we can see a new day dawning, in the hopes, too, that like President Nixon, like President Reagan, even like other presidents before us who have sat down and negotiate with our enemies, at the end of the day, we'll be a safer and stronger nation because of it.